Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Omer Ramil with the Greenlights Grant Initiative. I know you have busy schedules, so we want to make this as productive and meaningful as an hour and a half as we can. We're thrilled to be with you all today for our second Greenlights Grant Initiative webinar, Federal Grant Writing 101. We want you to walk away today feeling knowledgeable about federal grant writing and to start thinking like a grant writer and a reviewer to give you that advantage during this process. Matthew and Camilla McConaughey are so excited that you're joining us in this effort to ensure America's students are safe, secure, and healthy. We all have a role to play here. And with that, I'd like to share a message that Matthew McConaughey recorded for you all. Thank you.
Hey everybody, McConaughey here with the Greenlights Grant Initiative. I want to welcome you to the Federal Grant Writing 101 webinar. Today, we're going to cover the ins and outs of federal grant writing and answer key questions like, can I get feedback and guidance on my project idea before writing a grant to a federal agency? And who reviews my federal grant application? These questions and so many more are going to be covered during this webinar. We hope attendees will leave the webinar with a solid understanding of how to approach federal grant writing and think like a reviewer. Thank you for joining. And as always, just keep living. Hey.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Annie Karofsky. I'm here to present to you today the Federal Grants 101 webinar. I may have seen many of you in the first introductory webinar, and today we're going to take a little bit of a deeper dive into the actual preparing for and writing a federal grant. My background is in federal grants. I used to work on Capitol Hill in the Senate. And then when after I left the Senate, I worked for a federal grant making agency and have been here at McAllister & Quinn for about 12 years now. And my background is in project management, helping assist other nonprofits and organizations apply to and successfully be awarded federal grants. So I'm really happy to join you today, and I'm looking forward to getting into some of the details. So next slide, please. So just a little bit about us, McAllister & Quinn. We are a DC-based consulting firm. We were founded in 2004, but in 2010, we really got into the federal grant writing spectrum. We specialize in securing funding for a wide range of our clients. We represent nonprofits, municipalities, healthcare organizations, and also higher ed institutions. There are about 98 of us now, I think, based here in DC, but also remotely. And we are fortunate to work with a large grant writer network of over 275 professional grant writers and consultants. Those folks come from federal agencies, or they have been development directors in the past, so they're very knowledgeable on all federal grants across the agencies. And working with them, we've been pretty successful. We've now cleared almost $1.8 billion in federal funding since we started this in 2010. So that's just a little bit of background about our firm here in DC. Next slide. So today we're going to kind of take a deeper dive into preparing for writing a federal grant. So it all starts with reading the Notice of Funding Opportunity, or the NOFO, and all of its requirements, creating a project team, creating a project timeline for your grant application, planning and developing a concept paper to actually start the writing process, getting into developing and drafting the narrative, which is really the real structure of your grant application, creating a budget and a budget justification. There will be another webinar in December that really gets into more details about how to craft a budget, how to prepare a budget, and also drafting a budget justification. So you will, I encourage you all to join that webinar in December to go over those aspects. I'll touch a little bit on it today, but really if you want some more detail on creating a budget, I encourage you to attend that December webinar. We'll also talk about submitting the grant and the agency review process, and then end the webinar today by just kind of reviewing some best practices and then getting into some Q&A at the end. So next slide, please. So where to start? Understanding the NOFO, or Notice of Federal Funding Opportunity, completely. It's also noted as a solicitation or an FOA. But you will want to read through that NOFO, read it once, use a highlighter, read it again, and highlight important sections. I actually am working on a big grant right now. As you can see, I've highlighted everything. I've written all over it. I've put flags in there to really go and highlight some of those sections of the grant that I want to refer back to. So I really encourage you to do that. When you're going through the NOFO for the first time, really note these important sections, the deadline, and really look and plan for that deadline. It is a hard stop deadline. Anything you submit past that deadline will not be successful. They will not review it, and it'll be thrown out because you didn't submit it by the deadline. Look at the agency priorities and language. Look at the required activities in the grant, the page limits, the fonts, the margin size, the attachments checklist, which is appearing at the end of the NOFO. You'll look at allowable and unallowable expenditures. So what can you use the money for, what you cannot use the money for, and then reviewing the review criteria at the end. So we're going to just take a few minutes here in the first part of this webinar to actually look at an example NOFO, and I'll raise some points that you should really pay attention to as you're reading through it. So next slide. So here's a screenshot of a sample NOFO. This is last year's FY23 BJA Stop School Violence Grant, which many of you will be applying to. This solicitation or NOFO doesn't change a whole lot from year to year, but I really wanted to get you familiarized with what a NOFO looks like. So here you have on the front page where it gives you the title of the NOFO. It also gives you some important opportunity numbers there. That grants.gov opportunity number is the identification of this NOFO. So if you're interested in reading last year's solicitation, you can just put that number into the search in grants.gov and you can pop up the full NOFO and read through it to familiarize yourself with what this NOFO will look like in the next funding opportunity in 2024. So you want to really pay attention to those two deadlines there. So the BJA Stop School Violence Grant has a two-step application process. So step one is where you will apply for a first couple of forms through grants.gov. That has to be uploaded by a certain date and time. Note that date time where it says 8:59 p.m. Eastern time. So if you're in Central Time or West Coast Pacific time, really note that date stamp and the time, because anything a second over that will not be reviewed. You will not be able to apply. Once that window closes, it's closed and it's not negotiable. So really pay attention to those deadlines. The stage 2 deadline on Just Grants, which is through the Department of Justice, has a different timeline, has a different submission deadline. So once you apply through grants.gov and do that step 1, it will generate the second part of your application through the Just Grant. So you will want to pay attention to both of those deadlines. I would really recommend that you apply on that first step 1 application very soon, because it will generate that full application in Just Grants and you can start working on the application, on the attachments and uploading your budget and everything early, so that when you're ready to submit, everything's already in there. So just to go into kind of that first couple pages of this NOFO, they'll give you a short overview of the grant and then really pay attention to those eligible applicants. So this tells you who can apply, who's eligible to apply, and then in this state, in this particular NOFO, you have 2 categories. So pay attention to those categories if there are categories, to make sure that you are applying to the appropriate category for the type of organization you are. So note that in category 2, you will have nonprofits, also independent school districts and schools. So really pay attention to those requirements on the first couple pages of the NOFO. So next slide. So also in the beginning of the NOFO, agencies typically list out the priority areas. So these are kind of priorities of the agency and of that specific NOFO. So here you see that supporting racial equity and underserved communities is a priority of the BJA STOP grant. Also looking at culturally specific organizations, and it kind of defines those below. So those organizations that their defined purpose is to really address the needs and serve culturally specific populations. So pay attention to those priority areas too, because they will be part of the consideration when the grant goes to review. So next slide. So this is really getting into the meat and bones of the proposal narrative. So about 5 or 6 pages into the NOFO, a little bit more, you will have this outline of the proposal narrative. You'll really want to pay attention to these highlighted areas, particularly the limitations of the pages, the fonts, the margins. This is really important because if you exceed those 15 pages, then your application will be thrown out. That 15-page limit is a hard and fast limit. You do not want to go one word over, particularly when you're submitting a grant. Your narrative is going to be submitted as a PDF. So when you transfer your Word file and save it as a PDF, you want to make sure and double check that moving it to a PDF file does not set you over that 15-page limit. So really, really pay attention to this in every single NOFO that you're going to be applying to, because this is really important. You could get thrown out for going over and having a 16-page response. So really pay attention to those details. Getting into the description of the issue, the project design and implementation. Now note that each of these subcategories also have sort of sub-questions that you'll want to highlight in each of these sections so that you're hitting all the requirements in each of these sections. So when you read through it, highlight those other things that you'll need to include under that specific section. So really note those as you're going through the NOFO. Follow these subheadings in your response as you plan out your outline for your narrative. Follow these exact subheadings, use the exact words so that the reviewers, when they're reviewing your proposal, know that you've met every single requirement of this grant application. So really pay attention to that kind of detail. So next slide. Review criteria. So this is typically at the end of the NOFO before it gets into the application checklist. This review criteria is actually what your reviewers are going to be using to review and score your application or give it points. So the reviewers are typically members of the public. So the agency will have sort of an open call for reviewers. You can actually be a reviewer for a grant. If you have extra time, you can apply through the agency website. It'll typically have a little banner at the top of the agency website saying, interested in becoming a reviewer, and you can send in your resume and fill out the application, and you may actually be able to become a reviewer. So if you have an interest in that, it's a really good way to see what it's like to become a reviewer. So I encourage you to do that if you have some extra time. But this criteria is really important to pay attention to. Note that the review criteria follow the subheadings of that narrative description earlier in the NOFO that I was just going through. So look at the scoring. See the example for number 1, statement of the problem description. This is your need, your description of the need for this grant. Why do you need this grant? They're scoring it at 20%. So 20% of the total score is going to be based on that particular section. Notice that number 2 under project design and implementation is 30%. That section carries the most weight. So that tells you, hey, I should dedicate a lot of time, much more space in my 15-page narrative to really focusing on the project design and implementation. This is your plan, this is what you're going to do, and these are your activities. So you will want to spend most of your page numbers really focusing on that initial project design and implementation section. Notice at the end that your sustainability plan is only 10%. So that would say to me, paragraph or two about your sustainability plan. Now, what does that mean? That means, what are you going to do to continue this project beyond the grant funding? So if this is a 3-year grant, how are you going to continue it past that 3-year time period? Are you going to fundraise? Are you going to go after other foundation grants to support the project? Maybe funding's already been set aside at the school district level to really continue what's been successful through this project. So really pay attention to that scoring criteria and base your response based on those criteria in the weighted sections. Pay attention to that. At the bottom, there's some other review criteria factors that the reviewers will take into consideration. They'll also look at their priority areas, including geographic distribution of the grants. So they'll want to stretch out and fund organizations throughout the US. So they'll want to look for geographic diversity. They'll also want to ensure that your budget matches your narrative. Those are the kinds of things that they also will be looking at as they review your grant. So next slide. The application checklist. So most NOFOs, in fact, all of them certainly include an application checklist. So this really walks you through the required attachments and the forms that you'll be filling out online on grants.gov and Just Grants. So pay attention to this. This will help you plan out the time you'll need and the attachments you're going to need to upload for your grant, including resumes. If there's any logic models required, you'll have to upload your narrative and your abstract and those types of things. So really pay attention to this application checklist on what you will need to prepare for submitting the grant. Next slide. So this just kind of continues along those lines, your proposal abstract, your narrative, all of these things that go into your full application. Next slide. So next steps, once you've decided and read through the NOFO and really kind of outlined what the requirements are, you'll want to start thinking about putting together your project team. So some of the skills and knowledge you'll want to have on your team is really a program expert. So who in your team or who in your organization or school really has kind of that first hand knowledge of the project and what you're doing. So for example, if you're applying for additional counselors or mental health services for your students, who can you bring to the team that really knows the needs of the students, the needs of the counseling department, and bring them on your team? You'll also want somebody who has a lot of experience kind of gathering data, who's kind of like a quasi-researcher, who enjoys gathering data or can access websites for you to kind of pull data about your school district, also about the community. You know, what's the community situation where your school lies? Have you had, for example, increased prevalence in gang activity or drug activity or instances of violence recently? Or you have a very large and thriving refugee or newly arrived population. So you want to really have somebody on your team that can pull that kind of information, that local information and that school-based data information. You want somebody who knows numbers, who's really good at building a budget. This can be an accountant, somebody with an accounting background, or also could be your CFO at your school, just somebody who's really good at numbers and can help you put some figures to your activities to really align that with your activities in your narrative, what you're going to do and how to kind of align that with dollar figures. And then finally, you'll also want somebody with strong writing skills and attention to detail to actually pull together the narrative of the grant. Somebody who enjoys writing, who can write clearly, who's maybe done some writing in the past, to really help you kind of be that point person who's going to serve as your lead writer. And then finally, somebody who has some knowledge of the submission portal. So somebody who has the time or has experience with grants.gov or Just Grants, if not somebody who's willing to take the time to actually go into grants.gov and to Just Grants to educate themselves on how to really upload and submit the grant. There are some really good teaching videos, both on the front page of the grants.gov website, where they have some tutorials that are really, really helpful. The same with Just Grants. So there's some really helpful videos and instructional videos on how to actually upload and submit and fill out the forms on those two submission portals. So really pulling together a team of people who are really motivated and want to help and have these kinds of skills that can really help you pull together a competitive proposal. So next slide. So your project timeline model, I kind of reviewed this in the first webinar to give you an idea of kind of how we pull together a timeline when we're moving forward with a really major grant project. So as I had mentioned before, the conceptualization is actually just pulling together that concept paper. It's the who, what, when, where, how, why, really thinking about the need. Why do we need this project? Why is it important that we apply for this? What are the activities? What do we want to fund? What are we going to use the grant dollars for to improve and make our schools safer? You want to have the project team come together and review that outline of the grant that everybody's in agreement upon, that you really create a structure that everybody can build upon moving forward to write that narrative. And then you want to use that concept paper to assist your grant writer in actually using that outline to put some words into those concepts, into those ideas. We typically kind of use short points to really create that concept paper. And then your writer can really take that and build upon that to make the narrative flow and really follow that NOFO structure. And then once you've created your narrative, you want to really have somebody outside your team just review the draft. Just read through it. Does it make sense? Does it flow? Does it tell a good story? Does it really talk about your school and the need, or the school district and the need and the community and why this grant is important? So really have an outside person come in and read through it, because I know once you start working on a grant proposal, everybody's been knee deep in it and working on it, and you're kind of lost in the words, and you really need somebody else to come in and have sort of a second pair of eyes on it to give you kind of a fresh look at the application. And then finally, once you've made those changes and had somebody review it and you've made changes and improved it, you really want to have somebody who's a good editor, or at least has some good editing skills, to really read through it, make sure the grammar's okay, spell check it, make sure the spelling, and also make sure that the fonts are correct, that the font size is correct, and that your margins are 1-inch margins. Remember, going back to that narrative description on those really specific requirements of the font, the margins, and the font size. So make sure in that copy edit process you're paying attention to that. And then submitting the application. Really, really submit early. I can't emphasize that more. Grants.gov and Just Grants have tech issues sometimes, so you really want to make sure you're submitting at least a couple days before that deadline in case there are any technical glitches, that you can go in, make any changes, address those, and make sure that the whole application is in there before the deadline. So next slide. So the planning, this is getting into more of actually developing that concept paper that I just went into on the timeline, the project timeline. So really create a one-page concept of your idea. So really set the stage with your need, the issue. What are you trying to solve? A couple of paragraphs or a couple points about that. What is the issue you're trying to solve that you want to use this grant money for, to resolve? Identify and describe your population. So really paint a picture for the reviewer of what your school district or school looks like. Give them a picture of the community around it, as I had mentioned before. You can use graphs, you can use little maps, you can use any type of illustration like a graph or a map or a table to kind of really build that picture in the reviewer's mind about what that community looks like, what your school looks like, really create that image. And then what are your project activities? What do you need? What are you going to use the grant dollars for to address that need? So are you going to need to hire staff or have personnel? Are you going to need counselors? Are you going to use a specific evidence-based curriculum to address mental health needs, or trauma-based curriculum, trauma-informed care to assist students who may be having instances of trauma in the school? So what is your grant going to be used for? Also, what's unique about your school or your school population? As I mentioned before, maybe you have a very large number of recently arrived people from Mexico or Latin America, or you have other populations of folks in your community that are from other countries, or there's something in your community that makes you unique. What's unique about your school? Are you doing some innovative programming after school? Share those types of hooks that really make your community and your school stand out in the grant, that tell a story about your school. And then again, have somebody else review your concept paper, make sure it makes sense. Is it clear? Can they tell what you're actually going to be applying for through this grant? And then you can also take that concept paper and reach out to the program officer listed in the NOFO. So sometimes you can request a short meeting. So sometimes they'll be able to take 30 minutes with you, talk through the concept paper and what you're going to be applying for, and provide you some feedback, some early feedback. That may not always be the case across agencies, but it doesn't hurt to reach out to see if you can get some of that early feedback, and then make any final tweaks or recommendations or changes based on what their advice is and their recommendations of the program officer. So next slide. So writing, now getting into the developing and drafting the narrative. So again, create the outline based on that review criteria and the NOFO and that project narrative description, which typically match the review criteria. So you want to create that extended outline and also include those kind of subcategories of questions under each section. So under the need statement, sometimes there'll be other sort of sub questions under there about describing the population or describing the school or the data, the number of students. You'll really want to create a very detailed outline, because that's really going to serve as the basis of putting the words around that outline. When you're going through and drafting the narrative, we always focus on one section at a time. So for example, if you're meeting together with your project team one week and you're really focusing on one section like the need, that'll really help you structure and kind of build upon the narrative. So you're not jumping all over the place in the narrative. You're focusing on one section at a time. And that really helps create a flow when you're writing and doing transitional paragraphs or sentences between one section and the other. It'll make your writing flow much easier. Write clearly and use subheadings. So feel free, under those major headings of the review criteria, you'll want to use subheadings to kind of help guide the reviewer. So if you're talking about a specific school, use subheadings to describe those schools. If you're talking about a different section of the population, pull out those subheadings to help guide the reviewer. And again, use tables and graphs and maps. That's a great way to break up the text. So if you're a reviewer and you're reading pages and pages of text, it's really nice to have it broken up with a graph or a table. So for example, if you're talking about your school's demographics, you can do that in a table. You can describe the population, the number, and the percentage of the population. You can do that really clearly in a table, or you can even sort of do a map of your school district and show where the schools are by doing a screenshot. That's also really helpful for reviewers to get kind of an image in their mind of where your school or school district is and the community surrounding it. Also, avoid acronyms, or avoid them all the time, or use sparingly if they're needed, and define them, because not the reviewers are just like you and me, so they may not be as familiar with a certain acronym as you are. So make it easy for them. Don't leave them guessing. So try and avoid those. Again, find your hook and what makes your school district unique. Really pull out those things that maybe you're doing some innovative programming, you have a unique population, or you want to approach the problem in a different way than others have approached it. So really find your hook, what makes you different from all the other schools that will be applying to this grant. And then finally, make it flow and use the language of the NOFO. So if they're using terms like racial justice, underrepresented communities, make sure you echo that language in your grant so that it really flows and really speaks to the reviewers as they're reviewing your application. Also write more formally. We typically write in the third person. So really keep that in mind when you're writing a federal grant application. Make it a little more formal and make your writing very clear. Use shorter sentences. Make it very clear to the reviewer exactly what you're doing and follow that NOFO structure. So next slide, please. So again, we'll be getting into creating your budget and budget justification in December at the December webinar in much more detail, but I really wanted to highlight it a little bit here to kind of get you prepared. Creating a budget may not be as easy as you think. So you really don't want to wait until the last minute. As soon as you have your outline of what your activities are going to be, what you want to use your grant for, start kind of doing what we call a back of the envelope calculation to kind of make some estimates and align your budget with the narrative. So your activities, your partners, and your personnel. I'll get into that in a minute. Another thing you really want to pay attention to in your budget justification and your budget is when you're reading the NOFO, you will want to make note of whether there's any kind of match. I think most of the grants that you will be working on do not have a match, but really pay attention to that. It will be listed in the budget section of the NOFO, typically after the narrative description that we went through before. Also take note of any required travel for new awardees. So if you are awarded the grant, typically the Department of Justice will have a Washington-based introductory meeting for all new awardees, and it will outline in that budget section of the NOFO any required travel. For example, it might say grantees should set aside an item travel to Washington, D.C. for a new awardee meeting, and you will want to budget for airfare, hotel, per diem. That will be outlined in the budget section of the NOFO. So pay attention to that and highlight it when you're going through the NOFO so that you know that you will have to set aside that money because it's required of a new awardee in your budget. And you will describe that also in your budget justification. So remember to align your budget with the narrative as well. So some of the common budget categories in a federal grant application are personnel. So these are the people that are going to actually be leading your grant, who are going to be responsible for directing your grant and reporting on your grant. So this is calculated as a percentage of time that they're using, and this is based on salary. Again, we're going to get into those types of details in December, but just wanted to give you kind of an overview of the common federal budget categories. Fringe benefits, so those are calculated at a fringe rate based on your school or your school district. Travel, again, you will want to calculate the airfare and the hotel and the per diem if you're going to any conferences as required by the grant or any new awardee meetings that I just went over. Equipment. The federal government classifies equipment as any one item that is over $5,000. So I doubt in any of these grants that you will be applying for, you'll have any equipment. Most of it will fall under the next category of supplies, which includes like anything that you're using to conduct your activities. So paper, pencils, printing, any laptops or software that you'll need for program staff to actually conduct and make sure that you're fulfilling the requirements of your grant. So supplies would typically fall under that category and not equipment. Contractual. If the grant requires an evaluator, you'll want to contract directly with them. So that's their fee essentially under the contract section of your budget, or any consultants that you're bringing on for any professional consulting that you'll need to fulfill the terms of the grants. You may have an evaluator, for some of your grants. This can, and you will want to consider that when you're going through the NOFO, whether it requires an external evaluator or an evaluation. Indirect costs, these are costs associated with supporting the project. Some of you may have a federally negotiated indirect cost rate. Again, we'll go over that in the budget webinar in December, but you can charge at least 10% of indirect costs typically on a federal grant. So they will go into that more in the budget discussion. But that is sort of an overview for you, a general overview of what a federal budget looks like and the structure of a federal budget. The budget justification is really just a Word version, and you will follow these categories. It's a Word document that is based upon these categories. So personnel section, you'll talk about your program director and how you derived at the overall budget figure. So that, again, they'll get into this during the budget webinar, but just to be familiar with those types of categories here. And we can talk about this more in the Q&A at the end of the webinar. So next slide. So submission and agency review process. So my recommendation, and is what we do here too, is we create a desktop file for submission about 3 to 4 days out from the deadline. This is where you'll want to create a file where you put all of your final documents in to upload into Just Grants or to grants.gov. So this is really helpful because that prevents you from searching around on your desktop for all of these final documents. All of your documents will need to be in PDF format unless it's otherwise indicated in the NOFO, including your attachments. So this includes your resumes, your budget justification, your abstract, which is basically a one-page summary of your grant, and the narrative. So everything's going to have to be in PDF form unless it's indicated in the NOFO. So it's really helpful to kind of have that one spot where you know that all your final documents are. So when you're in grants.gov or Just Grants, you can just go directly there and upload those files. It'll make it really easy once you get to the submission part. Have your passwords and logins. So you'll have a couple of logins for grants.gov and Just Grants. So you'll want to keep those handy at the time of submission so you can get those, all your documents uploaded. Factor in time to input the budget and other federal forms. So in addition to your abstract and your narrative that you're going to be loading up into grants.gov and Just Grants, you're going to have to input your budget. You're going to have like an online electronic form that you're going to have to actually type in your budget figures under each of those budget categories I just went through. So for personnel, supplies, all of that has to be entered directly into that website. So you will need to have your budget finalized. It'll make it a lot easier to kind of have it in front of you so you can upload all of that. So you're going to want to factor in about, I would say, at least 1 to 2 hours to upload your budget and also to upload or submit your federal forms. So some of the federal forms you will fill out live online in grants.gov and in Just Grants. So you're going to want to factor in at least a couple of hours to do that by hand. The budget sheet on Just Grants and grants.gov will self-calculate. So it will calculate the total for you, but you will have to input all of the numbers yourself. So you'll really want to factor in at least a couple of hours to do that. So don't do it and save it for the last minute before the grant is due. And then finally, you'll want to save your confirmation for grants.gov and Just Grants. So when you submit, certainly through the BJA Stop Grant, you will get an instant confirmation from grants.gov that gives you a confirmation number that says your grant has been submitted to grants.gov. They will give you a confirmation number. Save the email and save and write down your confirmation number from grants.gov. If you need to ever call grants.gov for any reason, your particular application has that reference number. And then you will get another confirmation from the agency directly once your whole grant is submitted. So you'll get a couple of confirmations from Just Grants and also grants.gov. So keep those, save them for further reference so that if you have any issues, you can call both of those web support lines and reference your exact grant application. So the agency review process, so once everything's submitted, takes about 5 to 6 months for review. There's typically a 2-stage review process. One is programmatic, and programmatic means they go through the narrative, your abstract, your budget, and they're looking to see and make sure that you've fulfilled the requirements of the NOFO, that the grant is written well, you don't have any unallowable costs, you're really writing to the NOFO, you didn't miss anything in any of the project requirements. So it's really going through that first programmatic review. The second stage of review is the budget review. So once the program team reviews your program and your project for its merits, they will say, hey, and make a recommendation for funding. And then your grant application and your budget goes to the budget review team. So they will review your grant in actual 2 stages. So one for the programmatic, then it goes to budget review. So if you receive any questions from a program officer at the Department of Justice, particularly for the BJA STOP grant, for example, you will want to respond to those immediately, because typically they may be simple questions about a calculation or an activity maybe in your budget. Any questions related to your budget, it means your grant has made it through the programmatic review, and then now they're considering your budget and raising any questions about your budget. So you will want to respond to those directly if you receive any questions. It's not always the case, but if you do, really respond to those immediately. So in generally, the whole review process takes anywhere between 5 and 6 months, unless it says and states differently in the NOFO, but that's kind of the average amount of time for review. So next slide. Resubmitting. So declination, yes, is part of the game. You may not get funded on the first round. However, you will receive review feedback from the review panels. This is really important. The feedback really improves your next submission. It allows you to go through the reviewer comments, look at your narrative and proposal, and address any of those reviewer comments that are raised in the review. So you can go back and improve the draft. You can go back and correct it, improve it, make changes to it, and then resubmit during the next application process. You can even schedule a call in between with the program officer to go through your review. If there's anything you don't understand in your review, that's a really good time to reach out to the program officer and say, hey, read the reviewer comments, I'm not really clear on this. Can you please explain it? Typically, they're very happy to do that. They typically have about 30 minutes to go through reviewer comments, but I urge you to do that so that you can resubmit. Most of the grants that you all will be applying for this year are annual, so they pop up every year. So there will be another chance to resubmit. And really just carefully review those reviewer comments and make those changes, because it really can give you a much better chance at being successful the next round. And then, of course, resubmit. Always resubmit. You will probably have a better chance of being funded the second time around after making changes based on the reviewer comments and speaking to the program officer, if it's possible, on how to change and improve your application. So next slide. So just to review some of the best practices for writing, really write to the review criteria and the NOFO. Again, that appears usually towards the end of the NOFO, where it spells out the review criteria, and really pay a lot of attention to the scoring. So really focus on those sections that have the highest amount of percentage points or points allotted to that section. That's where you'll really want to spend most of your time, and usually it's around project design. So really make sure you're paying attention to that, stating clear goals and project objectives, making it very clear and easy for the reviewer to see exactly what you're applying for. Write directly to the agency goals and objectives stated in the NOFO, not what you want to fund. I know that's hard to do, but really follow the NOFO requirements and really use their language while you're writing. Make it a little more formal, write in the third person, do tell a story, but really write to the goals and objectives stated in the NOFO. It will make it so much easier for the reviewers to really follow and understand what you are requesting funding for. Use the agency's language again, use the language that they use the terminology that they use in terms of like underrepresented populations, racial justice, use the terminology that they use to describe certain types of services or populations. Follow the guidelines and structure provided in the application and provide only what is asked. Don't upload any additional attachments that are not in the attachment checklist or listed in the NOFO sections. So do not upload any extra things in your application that is not listed. Reviewers will not review it. It'll just add to the number of pages that they are receiving through the application process. So really follow the guidelines and follow the structure as outlined in the NOFO. Focus on one or two areas and have a hook. What makes your program unique again? What makes it innovative? What makes your school and community different? You can even use screenshots of recent press articles about your community, something that happened in your community, or something wonderful that's happening in your community. Talk about your population. Talk about some innovative programming that you're doing at the school that you're seeing some initial success with that you want to actually use and do and fund in this grant application. So really make it unique to you and tell a story. Tell the reviewers about your community, about your school, about your district, and what makes it tick, what makes it different, and really try and tell that story in a really compelling way. And then lastly, don't forget to review your narrative and budget together. Make sure that they align. Make sure that the activities that you're saying you're going to do in your narrative reflect the dollars that you're requesting in your budget, because that will make sure it's aligned, it's cohesive, and it's competitive, and the reviewers can see exactly what you're trying to fund, and it's reflected exactly in your budget. And account for every budget category. So you're going to want to break down every single piece that you're requesting, every cost. Again, we'll have a budget webinar that'll go through the budget in a lot more detail, and we'll go through each of those categories in detail, but really be able to justify that figure. If you're requesting $200,000 for personnel or for equipment or supplies, really have that calculation ready to explain in words how you got to that calculation and show the calculation in the budget justification. So really make sure that the budget and the narrative align with your activities. So next slide. So here's some additional resources for the school districts. The Greenlight Grants Initiative, they're going to provide some tailored and free resources, including these webinars, some additional memos, and then some other helpful tools that they've linked here. There's some other tools from the agency websites that can be helpful. And again, in the NOFO, when you're reading through the first couple pages, pay attention to whether the agency will be hosting a webinar for that particular grant. I really encourage you to participate in that webinar. They'll actually go through the narrative or the NOFO in detail. They'll talk about the requirements. They'll take each piece of the NOFO, explain it, what they're looking for in that NOFO and in the applications, and then stick around at the end for the Q&A, because that's where you get all of the detail about and the reaction from the program officers for specific questions related to that NOFO. Because if you've got a question about it, guaranteed there's at least 2 other people on that webinar that do too. So really take advantage of those webinars that are sponsored by the agency for that particular grant. You will learn a lot about the requirements, what the program officers and the reviewers will be looking for. So participate in that, have your project team or at least one person on your project team attend that webinar. And then the agencies will actually record those webinars and make them available. So if you register the webinar and you can't attend, you will get a link to the recording and also a link to the Q&A from that webinar. So you'll really want to participate in any of those agency webinars moving forward. Next slide. Okay, I think we're at the Q&A. So I will pause here and then be ready to answer some questions.
Great, thank you, Annie. And just as a reminder to the participants, please enter your questions into the Q&A function. And as another reminder, we will be sharing this slide deck and recording by the end of the week on our website. So we have a couple that have already trickled in. And the first one here is asking if the other and indirect categories on the budget are considered the same budget category, and can both be used in a grant application.
So the other and indirect, is that Tori?
Yes.
Okay, no, they are two different separate budget categories. Other would be other things that don't quite fit in to the other budget categories. That's why it's other. So this could include things like any other activities that don't fall under those categories. It could be any other supplies. It could be other curriculum development. It could be additional materials that you need that don't fall neatly under supplies. Indirect costs is a completely separate category. This is actually how the government sees as the cost of doing business. So it's the cost of your agency supporting the project. So this is the electricity for your organization. This is energy, like energy and water. This is keeping the lights on at your organization. It's all those indirect costs that go into actually running a program at your organization. So if you don't have a negotiated indirect cost rate, which I'm assuming a lot of you don't, you can use that 10% de minimis. It's a 10% allowable indirect cost rate. And a lot of people see this as sort of admin costs. It's like operational costs. It's the operation of doing your business, of your organization. So certainly take advantage of that indirect cost rate, because that's really helping you make up for some of the operating costs of your organization. So I hope that's helpful.
Great, thank you, Annie.
Mm-hmm.
Another question that we have here is, in the submission process, are you able to preview the federal forms that you'll need to fill out live?
Yes, you are. So both in grants.gov and Just Grants, you can preview the forms and you can go through them. In fact, on grants.gov, if you if you go into grants.gov and put in the opportunity number, you can download instructions, or you can actually look at you can click on the live forms and you can walk through them. You don't have to input any data, but it gives you a really good overview of what the forms are and the data that you'll need to pull together to complete those forms. You can also Google the form numbers and names from the NOFO, and you can look at them online too. So those are two different ways you can get previews of the federal forms.
Great. Another follow-up question on submission is, do we have to submit all at one time, or will it save our work so that we can return at a later time?
Yes, good question. Yes, you can save your work. Certainly at the end, at the bottom of every page for grants.gov and also Just Grants, just make sure after you finish inputting your information, there's a little icon at the bottom of the page that says save. Make sure you click on that so it saves all your information in the system. Typically grants.gov is a little bit easier because it will save more frequently than Just Grants, but just remember, after you've finished inputting information into the grant, into one of the forms, or you've uploaded something, click save before you log out so that it stays within the application when you go in and out. So you don't have to upload and submit all at once. You can go into the application and then upload some things and then, like input your budget and then get out and come back tomorrow and upload some other attachments so you can save. Just remember to save at the bottom of the page.
Great. We have another question here. Is it generally okay to use we in federal grants?
You can, but use it sparingly. We typically write in the third person. So for example, when you're writing, if you're a school district and you're writing an application, you'd say the district will do this, or the school will be doing this. However, if it makes sense, you can put a little bit of we in there, particularly if you're talking about an innovative program. You would say we instituted this and the results were X, Y, and Z. So use it sparingly. You typically want to write a federal grant in the third person, generally speaking.
Great. Another question on submission. If our district applies via workspace in grants.gov and enters the narrative, budget, and other information electronically, do we also need to add these documents via PDF?
Yes. Typically you input your budget sheet by hand. So you'll input all of the information into the grants form, and then you will save it, but you will have to upload your justification as a PDF file. Is that what the question was, Tori?
I think there's just some confusion on which documents are going to be manual entry versus PDF.
Okay. All the federal forms, thanks, Tori. All of the federal forms, including the SF 424, are typically manual. You can download and then re-upload them as a PDF, but a lot of people have had some issues with downloading the form and then trying to re-upload it. They don't take a lot of time to do, sort of physically by hand. We would say by inputting the data. The budget sheet, so your budget, not the justification, you do have to do input directly into grants.gov. So typically the federal forms, you have to input the other application pieces like the abstract, the narrative, resumes, any letters of commitment or support will be PDF'd and uploaded directly into grants.gov. And there'll be spaces in grants.gov and Just Grants where it will have a little icon where it will say upload. And then you can click on that and it'll allow you to upload the documents directly from your computer.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Another question here. You mentioned providing screenshots of press releases, photos, or other supporting documents in the grant application. Where might that go in the application?
Well, typically you can use it to support in your narrative. So let's say if you're talking about in the BJA Stop Grant, you're giving a description of need and you're describing your school district. You can put in a small map of your school district that's easy to read. Remember, when they print this off and the reviewers are going to print this off in hard copy, just make sure that it's easily read in black and white. So make sure it's not too blurry. Make sure it's very clear so that they can see the district or the map. Or if you're going to want to show your demographics and the difference of the school population, you can put in a small table just as a way to kind of break up the text. Because if it's a 20-page grant with a lot of text, it helps the reviewers kind of take a break. It's great for the eye too, that you give them a little snapshot and a picture to see, oh, wow, this is what their school district looks like, or this is where their school is based in the district. It's a really good way to help the reviewers really see where you are, where you're located, and provide them a little bit of information, like a picture in their mind of where your school is or your district is within your state.
Great, thank you, Annie.
Mm-hmm.
We have another question here on attachments.
Mm-hmm.
Are attachments all PDFs into one PDF, or should they be individually PDF?
Good question. Depends. on the solicitation. So you will want to read through the attachment section of the application in the NOFO. It will typically indicate whether there's one file or two files to upload. It will indicate whether you need to use the attachments form in grants.gov or just grants. And it will indicate in the NOFO how you upload those, whether you need just one major PDF for all attachments or whether they want them separately, but that is usually indicated in the NOFO. So follow those directions in the NOFO.
Great. We have another question here. What is the reason most grants have points taken off in the review process?
That's a really good question. One is that you don't follow the NOFO structure. That's one. You don't justify or provide data to back up your need. So citations, I know we didn't go through that yet as part of this webinar, but if you are citing literature or data sources, you need to cite them in the narrative, or if it's instructed in the NOFO, you can have a reference, what we call a references document, where you list out all of the references that you have in your narrative by number. So it's like a footnote. And at the end, you can create your references sheet for all of your citations in your document. That is one way that you can get points taken off. You can also get points taken off for not describing your needs sufficiently, that you've left questions open to the reviewers that were not answered. So really make sure when you're going through that review criteria in the NOFO and also in the narrative description section, that you're really answering all of those sub-questions under each heading. So under the needs section, you might have 2 or 3 sort of hidden questions within that paragraph section. Highlight those, make sure you respond to every sub-question within each section of your grant, because that's the easiest way to lose points, is that you're not addressing every single sort of sub-question in all of the sections of the NOFO. So really pay attention to that, because that's an easy way to lose points. Also, if your budget doesn't align with your narrative, you can lose points on that as well. So those are just a few of the major categories where you would lose points.
Great. We have another question here.
Mm-hmm.
Can we see grants that have been awarded in the past? And if so, where do we find them?
Can you see grants that have been awarded in the past?
Yes.
Yes. You can, there are a couple of ways to do that. Some agency websites have abstracts listed, but not the full grant. So you get a little paragraph description of the funded project, what was funded, what there were activities, but it's just typically a short abstract. There's a second way to get a full application, that is through the FOIA process. This is the Freedom of Information Act. You can make that request through the agency. There should be a section on the website where you can request a funded application, but you will need to know the name of the organization that was funded, the exact NOFO. So you'll need to know that funding opportunity number as a reference. And you will also need to know the number of the funded grant, which is typically listed in the awards on a federal agency website. So if you're looking for previous like BJA stop grants, you would go into BJA. They have a list of funded grants by solicitation by NOFO, and then they'll have the organization, but they will also have the award number. So if you were requesting a previously funded award, you will need that award number, the name of the organization, and the name of the NOFO to make that request. If you do make that request, it takes a while to receive it. It can take a couple of months or more to receive it directly from the agency, and there may be a fee, $10 or $20 to cover the administrative cost of the agency for copying it and mailing it to you. So it's a long process. We do have some here at McAllister and Quinn, some examples as well. But those are kind of the two ways to really see funded copies of a BJA stop grant. Or if you know an organization that's been awarded and they are amenable to it, and they can send you a copy of their awarded grant. So you can try that as well. If you know an organization or a school that's been funded, you can ask them if you can review a copy of their application, since it's been funded already.
Great, thank you, Annie.
Mm-hmm.
We have another question here. Will you please share more regarding appropriate writing styles for federal grants? Did you recommend writing in third person?
Yes, I would use, for writing for federal grants is really a little bit more formal than most of us are used to. It's more structured. You want to have your sentences very clear. You want to have, we say, less flowery, but you do want to tell a story. So typically you write in the third person, unless, as again, if there's something innovative that you're doing and we seems appropriate, if you're making an example of an innovative program or something you're doing at your school or your school district. So always kind of keep it a little bit more formal when you're writing, and write to the review criteria using their language. So it's not like creative writing where you're writing a short story. There is a bit of storytelling in there when you're describing your school and your need, but keep it towards the more formal use of language in a federal grant.
Great. Another question here is, are maps, graphs, and tables part of the 15-page narrative? They are not considered appendices, correct?
It depends on the NOFO, but typically you would include those graphs and the tables and any of the maps, screenshots, or tables in your narrative. So you're using it to sort of illustrate your point within the narrative, unless in the NOFO it says it's allowable to upload charts, graphs, and tables as attachments. So pay attention to the requirements in the NOFO, but typically you would include that in your narrative. And yes, it is included in that 15-page limitation. So you'll want to make, sparing use of those graphics, but make them count, make them really illustrate your point that you're trying to make in your narrative. So use them sparingly, but they can be very important in helping the reviewer really understand and set the stage for the need for your project.
Great. We have another question here from the applicant that has submitted a federal grant in the past. They actually applied to a FY23 competition, but never received feedback. What do you recommend for them to receive their feedback?
I would reach out to the program officer. If you still have the program or the project ID, the grant ID, so if you submitted and you have that confirmation number from grants.gov and also the application number assigned to your grant application, you'll need that to reach out to the program officer and request feedback directly from them. So they can pull it based on your grant number that you received as part of your confirmation. So you can reach out directly to them and request a copy of your review. That's unusual that you didn't receive it. Usually they send that through email. So if you've had any change in staff at your organization, maybe it went into their mail or their junk mail. But if it's not there, then you should reach out to the program officer with that confirmation number and the grant ID number that you received as part of that confirmation to get a copy of your review criteria.
Great, thank you. A follow-up here to being able to tell a story in a grant. This question is, in telling a story, are anecdotes acceptable?
Yes, I would say back up any anecdotes with anything concrete in terms of data that you have. So for example, if you're saying, hey, we did this innovative project, you want to show some data to back that up. So say you enrolled a bunch of children in an after-school program that was really successful, for example, in keeping kids engaged in school, and keeping them engaged and off the streets if that's an issue in your community where kids are engaging in other activities after school and you want to do something that's engaging them in some productive activities after school within your school. If you've done something like that, show some data after that. Talk about how many kids were enrolled in that after school program. So really kind of back up your anecdote with any kind of information, any kind of data that kind of speaks to that anecdote, if that makes sense.
Great. Question about references here. Would the references be part of the grant page limit?
Typically not, but again, that's going to be spelled out in the NOFO. I know sometimes for the BJA stop grants, they want the references as footnotes in your application, so pay attention to the restrictions in the NOFO. If it is not indicated in the NOFO, you can reach out to the program officer and ask them if references are allowable as an attachment. Typically, if it's not noted, we will include them as a separate attachment, and typically they're not included as within the 15-page limit. But again, you'll want to check the NOFO directly for that so that you are not dinged for going over the page limit with a page of references. So pay attention to the NOFO and see what the restrictions are on that.
Great, thank you. More questions here. What is the ideal proposal writing team size? What is too much, too many cooks in the kitchen versus?
That's a really good question. Typically, I would say, so it doesn't get squirrely, I would say 5, no more than that. Any more than that, it gets a little too many cooks in the kitchen. So really use, when going back to those skills that we mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, really pick your people carefully in terms of the skill set that they're bringing to your team. So again, you'll want somebody who's good with numbers and can help you with your budget, maybe a CFO or somebody with an accounting background or who's just really good at numbers. You'll really want somebody with strong writing skills who likes to write and is good at writing clearly and has a lot of attention to detail. So that'll be your lead writer. So really think of the skills that are coming together on your project team, and certainly somebody who's very familiar with the activities you're going to be requesting for the grant. So again, if you're applying for mental health services for your students, make sure you have somebody from your counseling department or who has firsthand knowledge of those types of activities and the need around that. So be really cognizant of your project team and who you're bringing to the table so that your meetings and your project design and your writing is very productive. So really, really streamline your team to really bring those key people to the table. You'll have a much more productive and competitive grant proposal that way.
Great. Another question here, as it pertains to sustainability, how do applicants typically speak to sustainability if that's something that's required?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So as you noticed in the BJA grant, when I was going through sort of the review criteria, sustainability had a 10% scoring factor behind sustainability. What they want to see is that, okay, you're applying for this 3-year grant. We give you the money for the 3 years. But then what happens after that? Do you keep doing these types of activities? Who's going to continue to pay for and or support those activities? So you want to speak to any additional fundraising you might be doing. Perhaps you have a commitment from a foundation that's going to help you continue that funding beyond the federal funding time period. You can speak to any perhaps school district or state commitment to assisting you in continuing those types of activities within your grant period. Particularly for the BJA stop grant, you might be able to reapply for another 3 years of funding if you're proposing to change or expand some successful aspects of your first BJA grant. You may have the opportunity to actually reapply for an expansion if you successfully completed your first 3-year program, and you want to expand it or build on the successful activities that you did in the first round, you may be able to apply for another BJA grant, unless it's prohibited in the NOFO. So those are all types of things that you'll want to address in the sustainability. Reiterate your commitment, the school's commitment, the district's commitment. Maybe it's written within your strategic plan of the district or your school, and really note that in the sustainability. Again, it's only 10% in the context of the BJA grant, but you will want to address it and address it very clearly.
Great, thank you, Annie. And just a note to participants sending in question. I've noticed there are some questions that are a little bit more technical and specific to some certain grants. If you could send those in an email to GGI, we can help you out with those.
Yeah.
So another question here is, what happens if we experience a change in staff after we've written them into a grant? Do we need to notify someone to make changes?
Yes, great question. So, for example, if you have a program director, a project director in your BJA grant, and for any reason, while the grant is being reviewed or after it's been awarded, that person departs your organization or your school, you'll need to reach out to the program officer assigned to your grant and notify them that you will have a personnel change. This is also the case if you have any budgetary changes in your budget. These are to be negotiated with the department and with your program officer. So when you're awarded a BJA grant or any grant, you'll have a program officer at the agency who is essentially assigned to your grant, to your project. This is the person that's going to be actually sending you reporting templates. So this is for your annual reporting as an awardee as well. So if anything changes during your award period, you can reach out directly to that program officer and say, hey, we've had a personnel change. We need to change the name in the grant. Or, hey, we need to shift around some budget issues in our budget, in our categories. You will need to negotiate that with your program officer. So it's allowable, but you will need to notify your program officer assigned to your grant, which will happen upon award. So you will have somebody, a contact directly at BJA, who is your main point of contact throughout the term of the grant period. That's a good question.
Great, thank you. Another question here is, who do you recommend serve as the project director for a grant?
Very good question. Who has the time, who has the interest, and who may have some familiarity with running a federal grant program? If not, I would suggest somebody who's very organized and pays attention to detail, because they will want to ensure that you are compliant with your grant application and your grant award. So this is the person that's really going to run everything. They are going to be the person that's sort of directing traffic around the grant. They are going to be the one that's ensuring the activities are getting done and done on time by the right people, that you're adhering to your budget. So really choose your person wisely, because it is a commitment to be the project director, and also somebody who's familiar with the programming that you're applying for. So that person really kind of wears a lot of hats, and their time is going to be compensated by the grant. So you really want to make sure that person's ready to take on that commitment. But somebody who really has firsthand knowledge of your organization and who is willing to really run the show, essentially, in terms of your grant project.
Great, thank you, Annie. We're also getting some questions on how to track current grant opportunities for LEAs in school districts as well as individual schools. We encourage you to sign up on the GGI website for our email alerts. We are tracking those opportunities, and you can also find a list of opportunities in the corresponding memos with additional information on our resources section on the available grants tab on our website.
Great.
All right, I think we have time for one or two more. We have another question as it relates to the budget.
Yeah.
What is the best format for a budget justification, and do grant agencies provide a template?
Some do, but not always. So a really good format for a budget justification, again, it's going to be a Word document. It will not be on your letterhead. It will just be a Word document. And then you will follow the budget categories of your budget. So remember on that slide that I presented sort of the common federal budget grant categories. So that's personnel, it's fringe, it's equipment, supplies, contractors, consultants, other indirect. So you will want to structure your budget justification exactly in that order of the federal grant budget structure, and then write out in a paragraph form that under that category what it's for. So for example, in personnel, you'll say the project director is blah, so-and-so, who will commit 10 hours of time over the course of the grant project. Their current salary is X. 10% of his or her time calculates out as, do the calculation and then summarize it. If you have any other personnel, you'll want to mention them too, their role, what they're going to be doing, and then how you calculated that portion of the budget to cover their salary, whether it's 10% of their time, it's 20% of their time, 50% of their time. You calculate that time based on their total salary, and that's how you get at your budget figure for a personnel. Supplies the same way. We need 50 notebooks priced at $275 per notebook, and write down what you need the supplies for. So really, if you have subcategories under your supplies, like office supplies, you explain what types of office supplies you need, what your calculation is, how you derived at that. And it's really just a word explanation of what that thing is and how you got to the figure. So back calculating essentially. And that's your budget justification. It's really just a word explanation of what that category is, what you're requesting, what types of supplies or equipment or evaluator, who that person is, how much they're charging per hour, or any other kind of fee type description in there. And then make sure that that calculation matches that category in your budget sheet. So make sure the budget justification and the budget align. It's really just a word explanation. And some NOFOs have a structure for their budget narratives, but not all. So I know that the Office of Violence Against Women in the Department of Justice has a budget narrative structure, but I don't think BJA provides that type of structure. So it really depends on the grant application. There will be some guidance in the NOFO. And I think, Tori, we will be providing additional guidance during that budget webinar in December. So please, if you've got budget related questions, it's going to be a great opportunity to really walk through developing a federal budget and a budget justification in that webinar. So really, I encourage you to attend that, because that's going to help you out a lot in terms of how you're going to structure your budget and your budget justification.
Great. Thank you very much, Annie. I believe that concludes today's Q&A portion of the presentation. Thank you all so much for your questions. Any questions that we have not gotten to, we will put into a FAQ document to be sent out at a later date.
Thank you everyone for joining, and remember to join us on October 30th for our next webinar, which is Making Your Case with Data. As Annie said, we have lots of additional great webinars coming up, so we really hope you guys can keep joining us. In the coming week, we'll send out a recording of this webinar as well as the slides, and from this webinar forward, we will be trying to send the slides in advance, as well as part of the reminder email, so that you have a chance to look over them before. So thank you so much, everyone.